Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we will continue our reading of Galactic Cluster, the short story This Earth of Ours by James Blish. Our heroes, Flomar 12 Upjohn and his companions, have crashed on the planet of Calais and have met one of the locals. In fact, they appear to have met the one and only local, a single hive mind shared by millions of bodies. Their basic and dangerous division of plans and purposes began with that. Sergeant Oberholzer was not a fool, as the hash marks on his sleeve and the battle stars on the ribbons attested plainly. He understood the implications of what the Kalian had said, at least after the mama's boy had interpreted them, and he was shrewd enough not to undervalue the contribution the poor terrified fairy had made to their possible survival on this world. For the moment, however, it suited the Marine to play the role of the dumb sergeant to the hilt. If a full understanding of what the Kalians were like might reduce him to a like state of trembling impotence, he could do without it. Not that he really believed that any such thing could happen to him, but it was not hard to see that Mama's boys were halfway there already. And if the party as a whole hoped to get anything done, they had to be jolted out of it as fast as possible. At first he thought he had made it. Certainly not, the consort of state said indignantly. You're a man, Sergeant, not a Kalayan. Nothing the Kalayans do is any excuse for your behaving otherwise than as a man. I'd rather eat an enemy than a friend, Oberholzer said cryptically. Have you got any supplies inside there? I don't know, but that has nothing to do with it. Depends on what you mean by it. But maybe we can argue about that later. What are your orders, Your Excellency? I haven't an order in my head, 12 Upjohn said with sudden disarming frankness. We'd better try to make some sensible plans first and stop bickering. Robin, stop snuffling. The question is, what can we do besides trying to survive and cherishing an idiot hope of a rescue mission? For one thing, we can try to spring the man from the dragon's crew that these worms have still got alive, Oberholzer said, if that's what he meant when he said they dissected all but one. That doesn't seem very feasible to me, 12 Upjohn said. We have no idea where they're holding him. Ask them. This one answered every question you asked him. And even supposing that he's nearby, we couldn't free him from a horde of Kalians, no matter how many dead bodies they let you pile up. At best, sooner or later, you'd run out of ammo. It's worth trying, Oberholzer said. We could use the manpower. What for? Robin demanded. He'd be just one more mouth to feed. At the moment, at least they're feeding him. For raising ship, Oberholzer retorted. If there's any damn chance of welding our two heaps of junk together and getting off this mudball, we ought to look into it anyhow. Robin 1 was looking more alarmed by the minute. If the prospect of getting into a fight with the Kalians had scared him, Oberholzer thought, the notion of hard physical labor evidently produced something close to panic. Where could we go, he said, supposing we could fly such a shambles at all? I don't know, Oberholzer said. We don't know what's possible yet, but anything's better than sitting around here and starving. First off, I want that man from the dragon. I'm opposed to it, 12 Upjohn said firmly. The Kalians are leaving us to our own devices now. If we cause any real trouble, they may well decide that we'd be safer locked up or dead. I don't mind planning to lift ship if we can, but no military expeditions. Sir, Oberholzer said, military action on this planet is what I was sent here for. I reserve the right to use my own judgment. You can complain if you ever get back, but I'm not going to let a man rot in a worm burrow while I've got a gun on my back. You can come along or not, but we're going. He signaled to Kassirer, who seemed to be grinning slightly. 12 Upjohn stared at him for a moment and then shook his head. We'll stay, he said. Since we have no water, Sergeant, I hope you'll do us the kindness of telling us where your part of the ship lies. That way, about 2 kilometers, Oberholzer said. Help yourself. If you want to settle in there, you'll save us the trouble of toting private hands with us on a stretcher. But of course, said the consort of state, we'll take care of him. But, Sergeant, yes, Your Excellency, if this stunt of yours still leaves us all alive afterwards, and we do get back to any base of ours, I will certainly see to it that a complaint is lodged. I'm not disowning you now because it's obvious we'll all have to work together to survive, and a certain amount of amity will be essential, but don't be deceived by that. I understand, sir, Oberholzer said levelly. Kassirer, let's go. We'll backtrack to where we nabbed the worm and then follow his trail to wherever he came from. Fall in. The men shouldered their sussmans. 12 Upjohn and Robin watched them go. At the last dune before the two would be out of sight altogether, Oberholzer turned and waved, but neither waved back. Shrugging, Oberholzer resumed plodding. Sarge? Yeah. How do you figure to spring this joker with only 4 guns? 5 guns if we spring him. I've got a sidearm, Oberholzer reminded him. Play it by ear, that's all. I want to see just how serious these worms are about leaving us alone and letting us shoot them if we feel like it. I've got a hunch they aren't very bright one at a time and don't react fast to strictly local situations. If this whole planet is like one huge body and the worms are its brain cells, then we're germs. And maybe it'd take more than 4 germs to make the body do anything against us that counted, at least fast enough to do any good. Kassirer was frowning absurdly. He did not seem to be taking the theory in without pain. Well, Kassirer had never been much of a man for tactics. Here's where we found the guy, one of the men said, pointing at the sand. That's not much of a trail, Kassirer said. If there's any wind, it'll be wiped out like a shot. Take a sight on it, that's all we need. You saw him run off, straight as a ruled line, no twists or turns around the dunes or anything, like an army ant. If the trail sands over, we follow the sight. It's a cinch to lead somewhere. All right, Kassirer said, getting out his compass. After a while, the 4 of them resumed trudging. There were only a few drops of hot, flat-tasting water left in the canteens, and their eyes were gritty and red from dryness and sand when they topped the ridge that overlooked the nest. The word sprang instantly into Oberholzer's mind, though perhaps he had been expecting some such thing ever since Robin 1 had compared the Kalians to ants. It was a collection of rough white spires, each perhaps 50 feet high, rising from a common dough-like mass which almost filled a small valley. There was no greenery around it and no visible source of water, but there were 3 roads, 2 of them leading into oval black entrances which Oberholzer could see from here. Occasionally, not often, a Kalian would scuttle out and vanish or come speeding over the horizon and dart into the darkness. Some of the spires bore masts carrying what seemed to be antennae or more recondite electronic devices, but there were no windows to be seen, and the only sound in the valley, except for the dry, dusty wind, was a subdued composite hum. Man, Carrera said, whispering without being aware of it, it must be as black as the ace of spades in there. Anybody got a torch? Nobody had. We won't need one anyhow, Oberholzer said confidently. They've got eyes and they can see in desert sunlight. That means they can't move about in total darkness. Let's go. I'm thirsty. They stumbled down into the valley and approached the nearest black hole cautiously. Sure enough, it was not as black as it had appeared from the hill. There was a glow inside, which had been hidden from them against the contrast of the glaringly lit sands. Nevertheless, Oberholzer found himself hanging back. While he hesitated, a Kalian came rocketing out of the entrance and pulled to a smooth, sudden stop. You are not to get in the way, he said in exactly the same piping sing-song voice the other had used. Tell me where to go and I'll stay out of your way, Oberholzer said. Where is the man from the warship that you didn't dissect? In Gnatus, halfway around the world from here. Oberholzer felt his shoulders sag, but the Kalian was not through. You should have told me that you wanted him. I will have him brought to you. Is there else that you need? Water, Oberholzer said hopefully. That will be brought. There is no water you can use here. Stay out of the cities. You will be in the way. How else can we eat? Food will be brought. You should make your needs known. You are of low intelligence and helpless. I forbid nothing. I know you are harmless, and your life is short in any case, but I do not want you to get in the way." The repetition was beginning to get to Oberholzer, and the frustration created by his having tried to use a battering ram against a freely swinging door was compounded by his mental picture of what the two Mama's boys would say when the squad got back. "Thank you," he said, and bringing the Sussman into line, he trained it on the Kalian's squid-like head and squeezed the trigger. It was at once established that Kalians were as mortal to Sussman flamers as all other flesh and blood. This one made a very satisfactory corpse. Unsatisfied, the flamer bolt went on to burn a long slash in the wall of the nest, not far above the entrance. Oberholzer grounded the rifle and waited to see what would happen next. His men hefted their weapons tensely. For a few minutes, there was no motion but the random twitching of the headless Kalian's legs. Evidently, he was still not entirely dead, though he was a good 4 feet shorter than he had been before, and plainly feeling the lack. Then there was a stir inside the dark entrance. A 10-legged animal, about the size of a large rabbit, emerged tentatively into the sunlight, followed by two more, and then by a whole series of them, perhaps as many as 20. Though Oberholzer had been unabashed by the Kalians themselves, there was something about these things that made him feel sick. They were coal black and shiny, and they did not seem to have any eyes. Their heavily armored heads bore nothing but a set of rudimentary palps and a pair of enormous pincers, like those of a June beetle. Sightless or no, they were excellent surgeons. They cut the remains of the Kalians swiftly into sections, precisely 1 metamer to a section, and bore the carrion back inside the nest. Filled with loathing, Oberholzer stepped quickly forward and kicked one of the last in the procession. It toppled over like an unstable kitchen stool, but regained its footing as though nothing had happened. The kick had not hurt it visibly, though Oberholzer's toes felt as though he had kicked a Victorian iron dog. The creature, still holding its steak delicately in its living tongs, mushed implacably after the others back into the dubity of the nest. Then all that was left in the broiling sunlight was a few pools of blackening blood seeping swiftly into the sand. "Let's get out of here," Kassirer said raggedly. "Stand fast," Oberholzer growled. "If they're mad at us, I want us to know about it right now." But the next Kalayan to pass them, some 20 eternal minutes later, hardly even slowed down. "Keep out of the way," it said, and streaked away over the dunes. Snarling, Oberholzer caromed a bolt after him, but missed him clean. "All right," he said, "let's go back. No hitting the canteens till we're 5 kilometers past the midpoint cairn. March." The men were all on the verge of prostration by the time that point was passed, but Oberholzer never once had to enforce the order. Nobody, it appeared, was eager to come to an end on Calais as a series of butcher's cuts in the tongs of a squad of huge black beetles. "I know what they think," the man from the Assam Dragon said. "I've heard them say it often enough." He was a personable youngster, perhaps 30, with blonde, wavy hair which had been turned almost white by the strong Chilean sunlight. His captors had walked him for 3 hours every day on the desert. He had once been the Assam Dragon's radio man, a post which in interstellar flight is a branch of astronomy, not of communications. Nevertheless, Oberholzer and the Marines called him Sparks in deference to a tradition which, 12 Upjohn suspected, the Marines did not even know existed. "Then why wouldn't there be a chance of our establishing better relations with the person on the fourth planet?" 12 Upjohn said. "After all, there's never been an Earth landing there." "Because the person on Xixobrax is a colony of Kali and knows everything that goes on here. It took the two planets in cooperation to destroy the fleet. There's almost full telepathic communion between the two, in fact, all through the Central Empire. The only rapport that seems to weaken over short distances, interplanetary distances, is the sense of identity. That's why each planet has an I of its own ego. But it's not the kind of ego we know anything about. Xixobrax wouldn't give us any better deal than Kali has, any more than I'd give Kali a better deal than you would, Your Excellency. They have common purposes and allegiances. All the Central Empire seems to be like that. 12 Upjohn thought about it, but he did not like what he thought. It was a knotty problem even in theory. Telepathy among men had never amounted to anything. After the pioneer exploration of the microcosm with the ARP effect, the second of two unsuccessful attempts at interstellar drive before the discovery of the standing wave, it had become easy to see why this would be so. Psi forces in general were characteristic only of the subspace in which primary particles of the atom had their being. Their occasional manifestation in the macrocosm was a statistical accident, as weak and indirigible as spontaneous radioactive decay. Up to now, this had suited 12 Upjohn. It had always seemed to him that the whole notion of telepathy was a dodge, an attempt to bypass the plain duty of each man to learn to know his brother, and, if possible, to learn to love him. The telepathy fanatics were out to short circuit the task, to make easy the most difficult assignment a human being might undertake. He was well aware, too, of the bias against telepathy that was inherent in his profession of diplomat, yet he had always been certain of his case, hazy though it was around the edges. One of the proofs was that telepathy's main defenders invariably were incorrigibly lazy writers, from Upton Sinclair and Theodore Dressier all the way down to, all the same, it seemed inarguable that the whole center of the galaxy, an enormously diverse collection of peoples and cultures, was being held together in a common and strife-free union by telepathy alone, or perhaps by telepathy and its even more dubious adjuncts. The whole galaxy held together by a force so unreliable that two human beings sitting across each other at a card table had never been able to put it to even vaguely practical use. Somewhere there was a huge hole in the argument. While he sat there, helplessly thinking in these circles, even Robin 1 was busy, toting power packs to the welding crew, which was working outside to braze together on the desert the implausible misshapen lump of metal which the Marine sergeant was fanatically determined would become a ship again. Now the job was done, though no shipwright would admire it, and the question of where to go with it was being debated in full council. Sparks, for his part, was prepared to bet that the Kalians would not hinder their departure. Why would they have given us all this oxygen and stuff if they were going to prevent us from using it? He said reasonably. They know what it's for, even if they have no brains. Collectively, they're plenty smart enough. No brains, said 12 Upjohn, or are you just exaggerating? No brains, the man from the Assam Dragon insisted. Just lots of ganglia. I gather that's the way all of the races of the Central Empires are organized, regardless of other physical differences. That's what they mean when they say we're all sick. Hadn't you realized that yet? No, 12 Upjohn said in slowly dawning horror. You had better spell it out. Why, they say that's why we get cancer. They say that the brain is the ultimate source of all tumors and is itself a tumor. They call it a hostile symbiosis. Malignant? In the long run, races that develop them kill themselves off. Something to do with solar radiation. Animals on planets of population 2 stars develop them, population 1 planets don't. Robin 1 hummed an archaic 12-tone series under his breath. There were no words to go with it, but the consort of state recognized it. It was part of a chorale from a 20th century American opera, and the words went, "Weep, weep beyond time for this earth of ours." It fits, he said heavily. So to receive and use a weak field like telepathy, you need a weak brain. Human beings will never make it. Earthworms of the galaxy unite, Robin 1 said. They already have, Sergeant Oberholzer pointed out. So where does all this leave us? It means, 12 Upjohn said slowly, that this central empire, where the stars are almost all population 1, is spreading out toward the spiral arms where the Earth lies. Any cluster civilizations they meet are natural allies. Clusters are pure population 1, and probably have already been mentally assimilated. Any possible natural allies we meet going around population 2 stars, we may well pick a fight with instead. That's not what I meant, Sergeant Oberholzer said. I know what you meant, but this changes things. As I understand it, we have a chance of making a straight hop to the nearest Earth base if we go on starvation rations, and if I don't make more than a 0.05% error plotting the course, Sparks put in. Yes. On the other hand, we can make sure of getting there by going in short leaps via planets known to be inhabited but never colonized or possibly hostile. The only other possibility is Xixobrax, which I think we've ruled out, correct? Right as rain, Sergeant Oberholzer said. Now I see what you're driving at, Your Excellency. The only thing is, you didn't mention that the stepping stone method will take us the rest of our lives. So I didn't, 12 Upjohn said bleakly, but I hadn't forgotten it. The other side of that coin is that it will be even longer than that before the matriarchy and the Central Empire collide. After which, Sergeant Oberholzer said with a certain relish, I doubt that it'll be a matriarchy, whichever wins. Are you calling for a vote, sir? Well, yes, I seem to be. Then let's grasshopper, Sergeant Oberholzer said unhesitatingly. The boys and I can't fight a 0.05% error in navigation, but for hostile planets, we've got flamers. Robin 1 shuddered. I don't mind the fighting part, he said unexpectedly. I do simply loathe the thought of being an old man when I get home. All the same, we do have to get the word back. You're agreeing with the sergeant? Yes, that's what I said. I agree, Sparks said. Either way, we may not make it, but the odds are in favor of doing it the hard way. Very good, 12 Upjohn said. He was uncertain of his exact emotion at this moment. Perhaps gloomy satisfaction was as close a description as any. I make it unanimous. Let's get ready. The sergeant saluted and prepared to leave the cabin. But suddenly he turned back. I didn't think very much of either of you a while back, he said brutally. But I'll tell you this, there must be something about brains that involves guts, too. I'll back 'em any time against any critter that lets itself be shot like a fish in a barrel, whatever the odds. Consort of State was still mulling that speech over as the madman's caricature of an interstellar ship groaned and lifted its lumps and angles from Calais. Who knows, he kept telling himself. Who knows? It might even be true. But he noticed that Robin 1 was still humming the chorale from Psyche and Eros, and ahead, the galactic night was as black as death. The end. And we will continue with readings from another author next week.